The smell of wet cedar and diesel exhaust still hung in the air when I drove back to the property the next morning. Dawn light stretched across the valley in long orange bands, catching on fresh tire tracks that did not belong there. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out of the truck. Something felt different immediately. Not wrong. Deliberate. Like someone had spent the night making decisions about land that was never theirs to control. A temporary construction fence now cut across the southern access road. Bright orange mesh. Steel stakes driven deep into the ground. A brand new sign leaned against the fence. Future community recreation area. Authorized personnel only. I stood there staring at it while a generator hummed somewhere beyond the trees. The sign was sitting on property that had belonged to my family longer than most of the houses in that neighborhood had existed. The creek nearby gurgled over smooth limestone rocks exactly as it always had. The water did not care about surveys, homeowners associations, or expensive legal letters. It just kept moving. I walked closer and noticed something else. Spray paint. Bright red markings across several survey monuments I had personally installed years earlier. The paint was still fresh enough to smell. Somebody had tried to cover the original boundary markers. Somebody wanted the lines to disappear. That was when a white golf cart rolled around the corner. Maggie sat behind the wheel wearing oversized sunglasses and the same smile she always carried when she thought she had already won. Her golf cart tires whispered across the dirt road as she stopped beside the fence. She acted like she was giving a tour of a resort property. "Community improvements are moving ahead beautifully," she said. Her voice floated through the cool morning air. "The homeowners are very excited." I looked past her toward the valley floor. Workers were unloading materials near the creek bank. Lumber. Concrete forms. Drainage pipe. They were not just talking anymore. They were building. The metallic taste of coffee still lingered in my mouth as I studied the operation. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had contacted me. Nobody had even attempted to hide what they were doing. The confidence was almost impressive. Almost. What Maggie did not realize was that every piece of equipment entering that valley had crossed a monitored access corridor. Every truck. Every trailer. Every delivery. The gate records existed. The timestamps existed. The camera footage existed. And unlike rumors at HOA meetings, Data never got emotional. She kept talking while I stayed quiet. "People want progress, Jake. Empty land helps nobody." The sentence hung there for a moment. Empty land? I glanced toward the ridge where my grandfather had taught me how to read water runoff after a storm. Toward the old maintenance shed where original engineering plans still sat in weatherproof filing cabinets. Toward the creek channel that supplied half the watershed downstream during dry summers. Empty was not the word I would have used. The workers kept unloading supplies. Air brakes hissed. Chains rattled. Backup alarms echoed through the valley walls. Every sound planted itself in my memory. Every machine. Every face. Every license plate. Because by then I had already started seeing something bigger than a property dispute. The farther I looked, the more pieces began connecting. This was not a landscaping project. This was not a neighborhood improvement plan. This was infrastructure. And infrastructure always leaves a paper trail. Somewhere, permits existed. Contracts existed. Signatures existed. The only question was whether those documents were legal. As Maggie drove away, her golf cart disappearing in a cloud of pale dust, I pulled out my phone and opened the county records portal. The loading icon spun across the screen while the morning sun climbed higher over the hills. 20 seconds later, my stomach tightened. Because the first permit number I entered came back with a result I had not expected. And suddenly this situation became a lot bigger than one HOA president with a power problem. The county records office smelled like old paper, copier toner, and burnt coffee when I walked through the door that afternoon. Ceiling fans spun lazily overhead. A printer clicked somewhere behind the counter. I found an empty workstation near the public terminals and pulled up the permit file attached to the number from my phone. The screen loaded slowly. Then the first problem appeared. The listed project location was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Completely wrong. The permit described work being performed on subdivision common property nearly half a mile away from the actual construction site. I read it twice. Then a third time. The workers in my valley were operating under paperwork tied to a different parcel entirely. The fluorescent lights hummed above me as I opened additional records. More discrepancies surfaced. Drainage improvements approved for one section. Excavation authorization for another. Environmental review attached to either location. Somebody had stitched together pieces of unrelated permits and hoped nobody would compare the details. Most people never would. Most homeowners trust the paperwork when they see a stamped approval. My grandfather taught me something different. Numbers tell stories. You just have to read them carefully. I printed every document I could find. Page after page slid into the output tray. Warm paper stacked beneath my hands. The pile kept growing. By the time I finished, the folder was nearly an inch thick. Then I drove to see someone who knew the area better than any government database. Old man Russell Tanner lived on a ranch bordering the eastern side of the watershed. 80 years old. Sunburned skin. Permanent coffee mug in one hand. He had watched that valley change for decades. The screen door creaked as I stepped onto his porch. Before I even sat down, he pointed toward the folder under my arm. Looking into the construction mess, are you? I nodded. His expression hardened. They have been visiting every property owner around here for months. The breeze rattled wind chimes hanging near the porch roof. Somewhere behind the house a tractor engine coughed to life. Russell took a slow sip of coffee and told me things I had not heard before. Survey crews appearing without notice. Realtors asking unusual questions about access roads. Investors touring creek frontage they did not own. The pieces started fitting together. This was never about a neighborhood park. It was expansion. Controlled expansion. They wanted the valley. Every acre of it. Every water right connected to it. Every access corridor leading through it. I drove home as the sun dropped behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the road. My truck tires hummed against the pavement, while the folder rested on the passenger seat. Back at the property, construction lights glowed in the distance. Generators rumbled through the evening air. They were still working. Still spending money. Still acting like ownership had already been settled. I parked beside the maintenance shed and unlocked the heavy steel door. The hinges groaned. Dust floated through flashlight beams. Shelves lined the walls. Weatherproof cabinets stood exactly where my grandfather left them years ago. I opened the first drawer. Engineering plans. Water flow maps. Inspection reports. The smell of aged blueprints filled the room. Then I found a long cardboard tube tucked behind a filing cabinet. The cap was sealed with faded tape. I pulled out a rolled survey map nearly 4 feet long. Thick paper. Original stamps. Original signatures. As the map unfurled across the workbench, my flashlight caught a detail that made my pulse quicken. Someone had tried very hard to hide a boundary line that should never have disappeared. And suddenly I understood why they wanted control of the valley so badly. The paper crackled softly as I spread the survey map across the workbench. Dust drifted through the beam of my flashlight. Outside, I could still hear the distant growl of construction equipment working beyond the trees. The original survey had been drawn in 1978. Hand signatures. County seals. Engineering annotations written in faded blue ink. Most people would have seen a collection of lines and numbers. I saw something else. I saw intent. The boundary everyone had been treating as flexible was not flexible at all. A narrow strip of land ran along the creek corridor like a spine through the valley. 40 feet wide in some places. 60 in others. It connected every major access point feeding into the development area. The route looked insignificant until I followed it. Across the map. Then I realized what I was holding. Control. Every truck entering the project crossed it. Every utility connection touched it. Every future expansion depended on it. The cool metal edge of the workbench pressed against my hands as I stared at the survey. My grandfather had not purchased random acreage. He had secured the critical corridor nobody thought about until they needed it. The next morning I visited the county archive building. Rain clouds rolled over the hills, turning the sky gray. The scent of wet pavement followed me through the parking lot. Inside, I requested every historical filing connected to the survey. The clerk disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, she pushed a thick records box across the counter. Some documents had not been opened in decades. I spent hours sorting through easements, maintenance agreements, environmental reviews, and utility records. Then another piece dropped into place. A utility maintenance covenant from the early 1980s specifically referenced the corridors shown on my survey. The language was simple. No relocation. No obstruction. No development without written authorization from the property owner. I read the paragraph twice. Then I smiled for the first time in days. Outside, the rain finally started. Water tapped against the windows in a steady rhythm while I made copies of everything. By late afternoon, my folder had become 2 folders. On the drive home, I passed the entrance to the subdivision. New banners hung from decorative stone columns. Future growth. Community investment. Luxury living. The marketing language practically glowed in the rain. What caught my attention was the temporary sales office beside the entrance. Cars filled the parking area. Potential buyers were already touring the project. Somebody was selling a future that depended on land rights they did not fully control. That evening I parked near the ridge overlooking the valley. The rain had stopped. Mist hovered above the creek. Construction lights reflected off puddles below. Workers moved between equipment, while generators hummed through the damp air. I raised a pair of binoculars and studied the site. New stakes had appeared. Additional grading work had started. They were moving faster now. Faster than they should have been. That usually meant deadlines. Financing. Investor pressure. The smell of wet earth filled the air as darkness settled across the valley. Then my phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen in years. Martin Reeves. Former county planning director. Retired. Sharp as a razor. We had worked together on flood control projects long ago. I answered immediately. His first sentence made every warning bell in my head go off. Jake, I just heard who is backing that development project, and if the information I received is correct, the people funding it have absolutely no idea about the corridors shown on your survey. The line went quiet for a second after Martin spoke. I could hear nothing except the faint hiss of wind moving through the trees outside my truck. Then his voice returned, lower this time. The investors think they are financing a straightforward expansion project. They do not know the access corridor exists. They definitely do not know who owns it. I looked down at the survey spread across the passenger seat. Rainwater still clung to the edges of the protective tube beside me. Every piece of evidence I had collected over the last few days suddenly felt heavier. Not because it was complicated. Because it was simple. Somebody had built an entire plan around the assumption that nobody would ever check the old records. Martin told me he had attended a private planning presentation months earlier. The developers had shown maps, renderings, future traffic routes, utility expansion diagrams. The corridor appeared on none of them. Not one. The smell of damp earth drifted through the open window as I listened. Then Martin mentioned a name that made me sit up straighter. A regional investment group out of Dallas. Serious money. Serious attorneys. Serious risk if they discovered they had been given incomplete information. After the call ended, I sat there for nearly 10 minutes watching construction lights flicker across the valley floor. Workers continued moving equipment. Engines rumbled. Backup alarms echoed through the darkness. Nobody down there had any idea the foundation beneath their project was already beginning to crack. The next morning brought another surprise. A certified envelope arrived at the property just after 9 o'clock. The delivery driver handed it over and pulled away. I opened it standing beside the old maintenance shed. Inside was a formal notice demanding immediate cooperation with future development activities. The language sounded official, polished, expensive. But the more I read, the stranger it became. They were asking for access rights they did not currently possess. They were requesting permissions normally obtained before construction begins, not after. The paper smelled fresh from the printer. Somebody was rushing. That afternoon I drove into town and met with an attorney recommended by Martin. Her office overlooked the courthouse square. Brick buildings. American flags. The distant sound of traffic moving through downtown. She spent nearly an hour reviewing my documents. Survey maps. Utility agreements. Permit records. Historical filings. Every few minutes she would underline something or place a small tab on a page. Finally she leaned back in her chair. Jake, I think they expected resistance from homeowners. What they did not expect was documentation this complete. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead. She tapped one specific document. The utility covenant. Then she tapped the original survey. Then another file tied to watershed maintenance obligations. Each document reinforced the others. Layer after layer. Protection after protection. My grandfather had built redundancy into everything. Not because he expected conflict. Because he understood infrastructure. Critical systems survive when multiple safeguards exist. As I left her office, the courthouse clock struck 4. Sunlight reflected off the windows across the square. For the first time since returning home, I felt something shift. The pressure was no longer entirely on my side. Back at the valley, construction activity seemed even more aggressive than before. New equipment had arrived. Temporary fencing expanded deeper into the property. Crews worked under portable floodlights. Despite the early evening hour, the pace looked desperate now. Investors wanted progress. Managers wanted results. Deadlines were approaching. Standing on the ridge, I raised my binoculars again. A black luxury SUV rolled onto the site and parked near the temporary field office. Several people stepped out wearing expensive suits instead of construction gear. They were not workers. They were decision makers. One of them pointed toward the creek corridor while another unfolded a large map. I watched for several minutes. Then a cold realization settled in. Someone at that meeting had finally discovered there was a problem. They just had not realized how big the problem actually was. The next 48 hours felt different. The confidence I had seen on the construction site began to crack around the edges. Trucks still arrived. Crews still worked. Equipment still moved across the valley. But the rhythm had changed. Conversation stopped when certain vehicles pulled up. Supervisors spent more time staring at tablets and paperwork than directing workers. Something was spreading through the project, and it was not progress. It was uncertainty. Early Monday morning I parked near a turnout overlooking the creek corridor. Fog drifted above the water. The smell of wet grass mixed with diesel exhaust from machinery starting another day of work. Through my binoculars I watched a meeting unfold beside the temporary field office. More suits had arrived. More black SUVs. More people carrying folders instead of tools. The body language told the story before I could hear a single word. Pointing. Shaking heads. Looking toward the creek. Looking toward the access road. Looking at maps. Looking frustrated. Around noon my attorney called. Her voice carried the calm tone people use when they know they are holding stronger cards than the other side. Several requests for public records had started generating responses. More importantly, some of those responses did not match representations made during project approvals. I leaned against my truck and listened carefully. Wind pushed through the oak trees overhead. Leaves rustled against one another. Every new document seemed to reveal another inconsistency. Different site descriptions. Different utility assumptions. Different property references. Individually they looked harmless. Together they painted a very uncomfortable picture. Somebody had built a massive development schedule on top of incomplete information. That afternoon I received another call. This time it came from someone I had never met. One of the investment representatives. Polite. Professional. Careful with every word. He asked whether I would be willing to discuss certain property questions. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. He never directly admitted there was a problem. He did not have to. The questions told me everything. He wanted confirmation of ownership, access rights, utility obligations, historical agreements, things investors usually verified before committing money. Not after construction has already started. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. The metallic taste of cold coffee lingered in my mouth. Across the valley, excavators continued moving dirt beneath bright afternoon sunlight. Yet for the first time since this began, I realized the real battle was no longer happening on the ground. It was happening inside conference rooms, legal offices, and investor meetings. The machinery was simply the visible part. The paperwork underneath was where everything would be decided. Near sunset I drove to the old dam and climbed the maintenance platform overlooking the reservoir. The water reflected shades of gold and orange as the sky darkened. My grandfather used to stand in the same spot after storms. He always said infrastructure reveals character. Good planning survives pressure. Bad planning collapses under it. Looking across the water, I finally understood what he meant. This entire situation had started because people assumed nobody would notice missing pieces. Nobody would question timelines. Nobody would compare records separated by decades. They counted on speed. They counted on complexity. They counted on people looking away. A sudden engine noise echoed from below. I turned toward the access road. Another convoy of vehicles entered the site. More executives. More consultants. More decision makers. The project was attracting attention now. The kind of attention nobody wants when unanswered questions begin multiplying. As darkness settled over the valley, construction lights flickered on one by one. Their reflections shimmered across the reservoir surface. I watched them for a long time. Because something told me the people arriving tonight were not here to celebrate progress. They were here to determine how much trouble they were actually standing in. 3 days later the first visible crack appeared. I was standing on the ridge just after sunrise when a white county inspection truck rolled through the construction entrance. The air smelled like damp soil and fresh-cut grass. Morning fog still clung to the lower sections of the valley. Workers paused what they were doing as the truck continued toward the field office. 10 minutes later a second vehicle arrived. Then a third. By lunchtime nobody was moving with the same confidence I had seen a week earlier. The construction site still looked busy from a distance, but up close the energy had changed completely. Supervisors stood in clusters studying documents. Phones stayed pressed against ears. Meetings formed and dissolved every few minutes. The project was no longer advancing. It was explaining itself. Around noon my attorney forwarded several responses generated through public records requests. I sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree reading them one page at a time. Wind stirred the branches overhead. The creek murmured softly below the ridge. Every document added another layer. Internal correspondence. Review comments. Revision requests. Questions that had apparently never been fully answered. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Nobody had intentionally built a development around accurate information because too many critical details had been missing from the beginning. Some people had assumed. Others had trusted. A few had simply signed what appeared to be complete. The result was the same. The foundation underneath the project existed on paper far differently than it existed in reality. Late that afternoon Martin called again. His voice carried a hint of satisfaction. Investors had begun conducting independent reviews. Not because someone forced them to. Because uncertainty makes expensive people nervous. The moment serious money starts asking questions, every assumption gets tested. Every document gets rechecked. Every signature gets examined. I drove into town the next morning for a scheduled meeting. The conference room overlooked a parking lot crowded with trucks, sedans, and luxury SUVs. Inside sat attorneys, consultants, representatives, and project managers. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Laptops glowed across the polished table. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody acted dramatic. That was the interesting part. Real pressure rarely looks loud. It looks quiet. Focused. Careful. One by one the questions surfaced. Ownership. Access. Utility obligations. Historical covenants. Environmental responsibilities. Every answer led back to the same corridor shown on my grandfather's survey. The same corridor everyone had overlooked. By the end of the meeting, several people looked exhausted. One consultant rubbed his forehead while staring at a map spread across the table. Another spent nearly 20 minutes comparing property descriptions line by line. Nobody liked what they were discovering. As I walked back toward my truck, the scent of hot pavement rose from the parking lot under the Texas sun. My phone buzzed before I even reached the driver's door. Construction activities tied to several disputed areas were being voluntarily paused pending review. Voluntarily. That word mattered. Nobody wanted a public fight. Nobody wanted headlines. Nobody wanted investors learning new facts from court filings instead of private briefings. Back at the valley, the difference was immediate. Fewer machines operated. Several sections sat completely still. Temporary fencing remained, but movement had slowed dramatically. For the first time since returning home, I could hear the natural sounds again. Birds moving through the trees. Water flowing across limestone. Wind crossing the open grassland. Standing beside the reservoir that evening, I watched sunlight fade across the water. My grandfather's old survey rested safely inside a weatherproof case. Beside me, the same forgotten document that had survived decades of storms, droughts, and neglect was now reshaping decisions worth millions of dollars. And the most remarkable part was this. I still had not played my strongest card. Because buried inside the final records box waiting back at the maintenance shed was one more document nobody on the project had seen yet, and when that document entered the conversation, the entire situation was going to change again. The records box sat exactly where I had left it. Top shelf. Back corner of the maintenance shed. Dust coated the cardboard edges. The smell of aged paper and machine oil filled the room as I carried it to the workbench. Outside, the valley had gone unusually quiet. Fewer engines. Fewer trucks. Fewer workers. Even the construction lights seemed less confident somehow. I opened the box and started sorting through folders my grandfather had organized decades ago. Inspection reports. Maintenance logs. Correspondence with engineers. Old photographs. Then I found the folder. Thick. Yellowed. Marked with a handwritten label in my grandfather's blocky script. Watershed Access Agreement. My pulse quickened immediately. I opened it carefully. The first page contained signatures. The second contained survey references. The third changed everything. I read the language once. Then twice. Then a third time just to make sure I was not imagining it. The agreement granted permanent maintenance and emergency access rights connected to the corridor. More importantly, it required written authorization from the property owner before any modification affecting water management infrastructure could occur. Not recommended. Not suggested. Required. The creek corridor was not merely a strip of land. It was part of an integrated watershed management system recognized decades earlier. Suddenly, every grading operation near the creek carried a completely different meaning. Every utility trench. Every drainage modification. Every construction adjustment. I called my attorney immediately. By noon, she was reading scanned copies. By 3 o'clock, she called back. Her reaction told me everything before she even finished speaking. Jake, this document was never disclosed during any of the reviews we have examined. I drove into town the next morning carrying the original folder inside a waterproof case. The courthouse square buzzed with normal weekday activity. People carried coffee cups. Delivery trucks unloaded supplies. Traffic rolled past beneath clear blue skies. Inside a conference room overlooking the square, representatives gathered once again. Attorneys. Consultants. Investors. project managers. This time the atmosphere felt different from the moment I entered. Nobody looked relaxed. Several people already knew new information had surfaced. They just did not know what it was. The folder rested on the table between us. The sound of paper turning seemed unusually loud inside the room. One by one the pages moved from person to person. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. They simply read. I watched expressions change. Curious. Concerned. Focused. Then increasingly uncomfortable. A consultant requested additional copies. Another began comparing the agreement against existing project maps. One investor spent nearly 10 minutes studying a single paragraph. The room felt colder despite the afternoon heat outside. When the meeting ended, nobody hurried toward the exit. They remained seated, talking quietly among themselves while reviewing documents again and again. Driving back toward the valley, I passed the subdivision entrance and noticed something missing. The promotional banners had been removed. The temporary sales office sat closed. Several vehicles that normally filled the parking lot were gone. Up on the ridge overlooking the project, the difference was even more obvious. Entire sections of activity had stopped. Equipment sat parked. Materials remained stacked where crews had left them. The generators that usually hummed through the evening air were silent. Wind moved through the grass. Water flowed across limestone. Nature sounded louder because machinery sounded quieter. As sunset painted the reservoir gold, my phone buzzed with a new message from Martin. The investors had initiated a comprehensive review of every major approval connected to the project. Every permit. Every assumption. Every property representation. I stared across the valley as the last sunlight reflected off the water. For weeks people had treated the situation like a simple land dispute. It was not. Now the people holding the money finally understood that too. And once they started pulling on that thread, there was no telling what else might unravel. The review process moved faster than anyone expected. Once the investors started asking questions, answers began surfacing from places nobody had bothered to examine before. The valley looked different now. Not physically. The fences still stood. The equipment still sat where crews had left it. The creek still wound through the limestone channel exactly as it had for decades. But the atmosphere had changed. The constant urgency was gone. The pressure had shifted away from landowners and onto the people trying to explain how so many critical details had been overlooked. A week after the comprehensive review began, I received an invitation to attend a final coordination meeting. The conference room was quieter than any of the previous sessions. No glossy renderings decorated the walls. No promotional materials sat on the tables. Just documents. Stacks and stacks of documents. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with printer toner as representatives reviewed the final findings. One by one the conclusions emerged. Property assumptions had been inaccurate. Access requirements had been underestimated. Historical obligations had not been fully disclosed. Utility dependencies had not been properly mapped. Every issue pointed back to the same mistake. People had focused on what appeared visible, while ignoring what actually controlled the land. The corridor. The watershed agreements. The infrastructure obligations. The things my grandfather had spent years protecting. Nobody argued with the findings. Nobody could. The records were too clear. The documentation was too complete. By the end of the meeting, several project components were formally withdrawn for redesign and reevaluation. Future planning would require new surveys, new approvals, and entirely new coordination with property owners. It was not dramatic. No one stormed out. No one slammed a table. Real consequences rarely arrive that way. They arrive through signatures, revisions, and decisions that quietly change everything. Later that afternoon I drove back to the property. The sun hung low over the hills. Golden light reflected across the reservoir surface. For the first time since I returned from deployment, the valley felt peaceful again. The generators were gone. The temporary lights were gone. Even the construction noise had faded into memory. I parked beside the old maintenance shed and walked toward the dam. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. The scent of cedar drifted through the evening air. Water moved steadily through the system my grandfather helped create decades earlier. Reliable. Patient. Unimpressed by politics. I stopped on the platform overlooking the reservoir and looked across the landscape. Every major turning point in this fight had come from something simple. A survey. A maintenance agreement. A forgotten filing. A piece of paper sitting quietly in a box while everyone chased bigger, louder things. My phone buzzed with one final message from Martin. The investors had officially ended their involvement with the original development structure and begun negotiations based on the corrected records. I smiled and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Down below, the water continued its slow journey through the watershed. The same water that had shaped this valley long before any homeowners association existed. The same water that exposed every shortcut taken by people who assumed history no longer mattered. Standing there in the fading sunlight, I realized something my grandfather understood all along. Ownership is not always protected by fences or signs. Sometimes it is protected by knowledge. Sometimes it is protected by patience. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply keep the records, wait for the truth to surface, and let everyone discover exactly where the real boundaries have always been. Justice is not loud. It is smart, patient, and inevitable.